Okay, welcome to today's group class. We are looking at mechanics of breathing today. If you do want these slides or any of the resources and activities that go along with this lesson, then head over to thepetutor.com and you can find everything that you need from one-to-one, group classes, the portal, the resources, the videos, everything you'll need is over on the site. So do check that out if you need it or if you want to learn more about these videos. Today we are going to be focusing on three different things. We're going to be looking at the anatomical components that work together to create inspiration and expiration. We're then going to be able to understand how pressure change leads to breathing in and breathing out, and then by the end we will know how these anatomical components can actually respond to exercise and physical activity increases so that we can breathe in more and breathe out more to satisfy energy demands inside of the body. So it's going to be a busy one, but we will get through it and it'll be absolutely fine. If you do have the time or you are in lesson at the moment, then you do have this starter activity to complete, and it's to do with practicing your breathing to become a little bit more conscious about what it is that causes you to breathe. So if you do have a moment, then do pause this and give this a go. Practice breathing in and really focus on what it is that causes that air to come in and out of your body. What muscles engage? What parts of your body are moving when you are breathing in and out? So if you do have a moment, then pause the video and give that a go, just to sort of draw attention really to things that are changing in your body to lead to breathing, or that lead to breathing, I should say. For today, we are going to move through, but if you are watching this on demand, then do take that chance to pause the video and give that a go. So to introduce this topic, what I wanted to say to start with is that air doesn't magically come in or out of our bodies. If we were to just stand or sit or lie down as still as a statue, no movement, no muscular contractions, if we sat there motionless, no air would come in, no air would go out. So it's in certain movements that cause things to change inside of our body, which leads to the outcome of air coming in or out of our body. And it's to do with that fourth point there, changing the shape of our rib cage, of our thoracic cavity, by moving, pulling and pushing our lungs into different shapes and sizes. It's that which leads to air coming in and out. So what we're going to be looking at today are the mechanics of breathing, those processes, the step-by-steps, muscle contractions, movement of the rib cage, movement of the diaphragm. We're going to be looking at all of that and how that leads to us getting air in and out of our body. So we obviously have two phases, three if you count the pause in between the two main ones, but we have inspiration and we have expiration. Now to start with, we are going to look at inspiration. So what is the change? What actually happens in order for us to inspire, to bring air in? Well, the rib cage needs to be pulled upwards and outwards. Okay, up and out. Now it's important that you remember those two phrases, up and out, because for expiration, as you'll see in a moment, it's the reverse, down and in. So up and out for inspiration, down and inwards for expiration. Now you might be thinking, just before we move on, so what? Why do we care about the rib cage moving? The ribs can't hold air, they've got gaps in, air's going to be seeping out of those bones, but it's our lungs which are attached to the inside of the rib cage, which are pulled along with the ribs. So if muscles can pull on the bone, well, the bone can then pull on the lungs because the lungs are attached to the ribs. So the aim of the game is to move this rib cage. Expiration, like I just said there, is downwards and inwards. Okay, so breathing in, we lift the rib cage up and out. To exhale, we drop it downwards and pull it inwards. So we're going to start off with resting levels. Then we'll move on to responding to an increase in exercise activity. So, like I just said, the lungs, they hang in the space that's protected by the ribs, and they're attached to the ribs. Now, this space inside and behind our rib cage is called the thoracic cavity. Okay, now we're going to be referring to that phrase, so it's very important for you to remember that or to write it down, to note it down. The thoracic cavity is the space inside and behind the ribs. It's where the lungs hang. And by increasing, or not necessarily increasing, but moving our rib cage in different directions, upwards and outwards, or downwards and inwards, we can start to manipulate the volume or the space inside the thoracic cavity. And if we can do that, then we can start to manipulate the lung volumes and how much air is inside the lungs. Because if the ribs compress and the thoracic cavity shrinks, then the lungs inside will also compress, and we can change the pressures, which is what we have here. The air pressure inside the lungs can drop, or they can increase, depending on if we're talking about inspiration or expiration. In the context of inspiration, we want air pressure to drop, and I'll explain why in a moment. But by dragging our rib cage upwards and outwards, we create more space in our thoracic cavity, and that leads to an air pressure drop. And what we're going to be covering in more detail shortly is this fact that air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. So if we can create an area of low pressure inside our thoracic cavity, that's going to invite air in a higher pressure environment to flow in. But for your exams, what you'll need to know is what muscles cause this change. Because it's one thing to say that the ribs move up and out, but bones don't move by themselves. We need to know what muscles are pulling on these rib cage, or on our rib cage, to create this change. And at rest, we have these two. We have the external intercostal muscles, and we have the diaphragm. And as you can see from the diagram, we've got these orange lines on the top half, and these are our external intercostal muscles. Okay, external because they lie on the outside of our rib cage. You might be thinking, well, why external, not internal? Well, external intercostal muscles, well, any muscle for that matter, they can only ever pull. So muscles which attach onto a bone, they have to be able to pull that bone. They can't push it. So if we want to move our rib cage upwards, well, the muscle will have to be on the outside of it so it can then pull it in that direction. So our external intercostal muscles, they lie on the outside of our rib cage, and they can help pull upwards and outwards. The diaphragm, well, that's this red dome shape in the bottom half of this diagram. And when resting, this diaphragm forms this dome shape, this upward curve. When it contracts, when it's stimulated, it flattens. So we're looking at increasing the space inside and behind our ribs, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. We can do it in two ways. Pull the rib cage up and out using the external intercostals, or we can take this upward dome shape and we can flatten it and we can create new space. So at rest, we've got external intercostal muscles and our diaphragm, which cause the changes which leads to the drop in pressure. So I'll leave that up there on the screen for you for a second. The external intercostals, they attach to the outside. They pull, they contract and move the rib cage outwards. They lift it up, they create new space, while the diaphragm flattens. By moving downwards, it creates this new void, this new volume, which air can now fill. When we start to exercise, obviously, the more muscles that we can the more muscles we begin to use, be it in our quadriceps, our gastrocnemius, biceps, our latissimus dorsi, whenever muscles are working, they're going to be demanding more oxygen. How do we get oxygen to the muscles? Well, we need, first of all, to increase our breathing rate. We need to get more air in so that we have the opportunity to get more oxygen out of that volume of air to then distribute it around the body. So in response to this demand for more oxygen, our body needs to be able to inspire at a greater frequency, at a greater depth. so that we get more air in per minute. And in order to do this, we can't just rely on that third point down there. We can't just rely on the external intercostals and the diaphragm. They're not going to be able to satisfy this increase in demand. Those muscles alone, they can only change the thoracic cavity size at a certain speed and at a certain frequency. So we need additional muscles, that bottom point there, we need additional muscles that can assist our external intercostals and diaphragm. By adding new contractions into this movement, we can add more force to it. They can move more efficiently because they're working together to move our rib cage further upwards and outwards, faster. And if we can do that, thoracic cavity space increases to a greater degree, more regularly. So we get more air inside of us. So what are these additional muscles? Well, first of all, we have our pectorals. So muscles, our chest muscles, our pectorals, in particular, our pectorals minor. Okay, the major ones are almost a handprint size on the front of your chest. The pectorals minor, they almost sit behind it and almost run a little bit more horizontally. So when they contract, they almost help pinch up. So when they contract, they can help pull the ribs upwards and outwards, helping the external intercostal muscles. A second additional muscle is our sternocleidomastoid, okay, which is this muscle that runs sort of just below your earlobe down to the top of your collarbone here, your clavicle. So if you were to sort of put your fingers into the side of your neck there and then take a sharp breath in, you'll feel these muscles bulge out a little bit. Well, that's because they're engaging and they're contracting to help pull this top section of our ribs, the rib cage, this top section of our rib cage, they're helping to pull them up. They're adding to the effort. And in doing so, we've got the external intercostal muscles, we've got the diaphragm, we've now got the sternocleidomastoid, and we've got the pectorals, all working together, all contributing, all applying force so that we can move this rib cage faster to a greater degree to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. So expiration, how do we achieve that? Well, we've already said that the rib cage needs to move down and in. Well, at rest, because we've just lifted the rib cage up and out, we've got gravity on our side. So at rest, where we haven't got working muscles demanding high amounts of oxygen all the time, we don't need that much air to be coming in and out of our body. We don't need pulmonary ventilation to be working too hard. So we can afford ourselves the time and the energy to lift the rib cage up and out during inspiration and then just let it go. We let gravity pull that rib cage, just dropping it on top of the lungs, which are inside the thoracic cavity. The rib cage drops, it returns to its anatomical position, and we've decreased that thoracic cavity size. There's less space for the air inside, therefore the air moves out. It didn't require any muscle contractions. It didn't require any energy to be produced to contract the muscles to pull the rib cage into its new position. We don't need to do that at the moment because there's no additional demand for oxygen. There's no additional demand to get rid of CO2. So we don't need inspiration and expiration to happen too quickly at the moment. So when we talk about the mechanics of expiration at rest, all we need to say there is, looking at that third point down, we just relax them. We relax those external intercostal muscles. We relax the diaphragm. They just return to their original position, pre-inspiration. And by doing that, we create this almost passive movement of air. It takes no stimulus of muscles, it takes no engagement of our nervous system to actually cause this change in our body. So it's a passive process. Much like if you were to fill a balloon up, there's enough almost elasticity and tension inside the expanded balloon wall, so that if you were to let the end go, it would just go back in on itself with enough speed, enough pressure to force the air out. We don't actually have to physically compress that balloon at the moment. We can just let it return to its normal resting shape and size. But then we start exercising. Then demands start to increase. We need more oxygen for energy release. We need to get rid of more CO2. There's an accumulation of lactic acid that we need to combat with additional oxygen. So our breathing needs to respond. Our respiratory system has to respond. Well, we've already said that inspiration needs to increase in frequency and depth, but we can't change our inspiration until we change our expiration. Let me explain. Imagine, so big I'll use the whiteboard behind me. Right, imagine, and we will look at spirometer traces in a different video, but a wiggly line represents our tidal volume, our regular breath in, out, in, out, in, out. We can't start a new inspiration, which are these upward curves, we can't start them until we have finished or completed the expiration phase. If we don't wait for the expiration to finish, then what would actually happen, or what we would see, is inspiration, half expiration. Inspiration, half expiration. And we'll get to a point where our lungs are completely filled up and we can't actually fit any more air in. So in order to actually use a better inspiratory rate, so increasing our breathing rate or increasing the volume of air that we breathe in, we also have to increase how much we breathe out. Because if we're left waiting around, so we breathe in and then we wait for the passive expiration to then breathe in quickly again, and we then wait for expiration, that's not going to be good enough to satisfy energy demands around the body. So instead, we have to have this combined effort. We have to have a sharp increase in inspiration, and we now need to force expiration to empty the lungs so that we then can fill them back up with new inspiration. Empty them, fill them, empty them, fill them, empty them. So expiration has to switch from this once passive process of just letting gravity do the thing, do the job. We have to switch from it being passive to active. We have to create this exhalation. We have to make this an active process. We have to force it. We have to engage muscles. We have to involve expiratory muscles. So when we exercise, working muscles are demanding more O2 and faster CO2 removal. To satisfy this, we need to get more air in and out. We've already spoken about how we can get it in. Now we need to get it out again. Otherwise, there's no space for the fresh air to come back in. So we use expiratory muscles, and we have our internal intercostal muscles, our abdominals, and our obliques. Now, the internal intercostal muscles, just like I said at the start, muscles can only pull. So if I've lifted my rib cage up and out, in order to move that rib cage down and in, the muscles need to be on the inside pulling that rib cage back in. The external, they lift up and out. The internal, pull down and in. So I contract internal intercostal muscles. My abdominals, that six-pack position, which connect to the base of the ribs. If we contract those, think about the body position you create during a sit-up. Your ribs are being pulled towards your hips, towards your thighs. So if we were to do that, from this position, from a standing position, the abs pull down and they pull that rib cage down, compressing the lungs. And the obliques, sort of towards the sides, or towards the side of the abdominals. they also attach to the base of the ribs towards the edge, and they can help pull that rib cage down. So we've got the internal intercostals pulling the rib cage in, and we've got the abdominals and the obliques pulling the rib cage down, faster than gravity alone. So how does air pressure work? I've said all about increasing space, and we've created high pressure and low pressure. Well, I'll leave you with this picture in question. If you were on that train, where would you want to go? Would you want to stay on the train? Would you stay on that carriage if there was one next door which was completely empty? Where would you go? Well, you'd probably try as hard as you can to either get onto the emptier carriage, or if this was your stop, doors would open and you'd jump straight off. You'd get out of that compact environment. Well, the same goes for air. When air particles are compressed and they're packed into a space and they're in a high pressure environment, high pressure basically means there's lots of particles with not a lot of space. Just like on that train picture. Lots of people, not a lot of space. High pressure. Just like how a deodorant can works. All of the particles of the gas inside are compressed into that can. Very high pressure. And as soon as that button's pressed and the nozzle opens, well, that's just like the train doors opening. The high pressure particles seek escape. They want to get out into the low pressure environment. They want space to move around and not bump into things. Well, the same thing happens with air pressures when we breathe. In order to get air to move into our lungs, I'm looking at this bottom part here. In order to get air to move into our lungs, we need to create a space inside of us that has a lower pressure than the surrounding environment, so that the air particles feel bunched up outside of us and they are invited into the low pressure space inside of us. So this, what I said at the very start, there's 3 stages of breathing. Inspiration, the pause, expiration, and the pause. Well, at this point here, we're talking about the pause. If you were to take a section of air and you were to measure the air pressure, how packed in the air particles were into that cube, and you were to take a cube of air from your lungs, if they were the same pressure, if there was the same level of busyness of air particles in each cube, well, there'd be no inclination for either particle to move to the other area, because they're matched, it's equal. Just like on the train. If you're on a really busy compartment and you can see the next one down there and it's just as busy, there's no point in moving. It's the exact same. But when we breathe in, what we actually do is increase the volume. So we expand the size of the cube inside of our lungs. So now the air that used to be in there, it's now got more space to rattle around in. So now this cube outside of us, that's now looking on and thinking, oh, hold on, the air particles in there have got loads more space than what I've currently got. I'm really packed in comparison to the amount of space available down there. So air is drawn to the space. It's drawn into this lower pressure environment until it's balanced out again. And enough of the air particles from up here inside the environment have moved in and packed it just as much as the busyness of the air around us. That's what leads to that movement of air. We expand that thoracic cavity by pulling the rib cage up and out, using our external intercostal muscles, by flattening our diaphragm. We increase the volume, we drop the pressure, air is invited in. Because air moves from high pressure to low pressure. Now it's time to exhale. And we have these same principles. We now need to shrink the cube. We make it so busy and congested inside of our lungs that we make it undesirable to stay. We compress the air so that it becomes a higher pressure area than the environment around us. So now the air inside of our lungs is getting so busy and packed in, it wants to move outside where it's got plenty more space to move around. Now I know air particles don't have a brain and they're not actually thinking about this, but that's the principle that applies. Rather than rattling around and bumping into each other at high pressure, air particles will escape and move where there is more space for them to go. Now that last point is very important. The quicker that happens, and the greater it happens, or the magnitude I should say, then the faster and the more air will get forced out. So going back to that balloon, if we were to blow it up and then just leave it, that's that passive process. In order to turn it into an active process, like we said on the board, that's the equivalent of blowing it up and then compressing it with our hands. So we're now combining the force of gravity and our abdominals, our obliques, our internal intercostal muscles, shrinking, compressing our thoracic cavity back in on itself, creating high pressure inside of us so the air is forced out into the lower pressure environment. So there are resource sheets, there are activity sheets to be completing. If you are in the portal, then you'll find it next to this masterclass or group class. You'll be able to download that, complete it, store it. If you want to know where you can get these, head over to either thepetutor.com or GCSE PE portal, depending on where you're watching this group class. If you haven't got those activity sheets, not to worry, but you will be able to pause that video and go back through just to solidify that understanding. So, inspiration in sport. Moving on to the last section of this lesson now. Well, when exercise starts, our brain knows that something's up. It's getting information from different receptors from all around the body, and it's beginning to paint this picture inside of our brain that we are moving. There are demands. We need more oxygen because there's less of it available inside of our body. And because of this, our brain starts to instruct, moving that second point there, our brain starts to instruct our inspiratory muscles to engage harder and faster. We start to use our sternocleidomastoids and our pectorals minor. We start to use all of the tools in our toolbox to lift our ribcage up harder and faster, to create that pressure drop, to draw air in, so that we can then extract the oxygen, drop CO2 back in, and then we expire. So we start to use those two additional respiratory muscles, sternocleidomastoids and the pectoral minors. Now with training, with regular use of these muscles, they begin to, they benefit from hypertrophy. Just like training any muscle, the more we use it, the more we stress it, our body responds by adapting, by improving that muscle so that it's better equipped to deal with the demands in the future. So the more regularly we engage these additional muscles, because we regularly, begin exercise and increase our intensity levels, and our brain engages these muscles, the more we do that, the better they become. Now this slide here is almost to do with the times of it all. The moment we start to increase our activity levels, the moment demands start to change inside of our body, our ventilation will have to respond. Now it might not happen that very second. There's always a bit of a lag time. But there's always going to be some sort of debt to repay. So even if we just did a quick 10-second sprint, 10-second run on the spot, our inspiration and expiration might not change in those 10 seconds, but 30 or 40 or 50 seconds time, we might notice a spike in our inspiration. Because in that 10-second sprint, we depleted oxygen, we created carbon dioxide, we created lactic acid. And we'll need to remove those. How? By increasing the amount of oxygen that we can get in and around our body. So the level of change and the duration of change, that dictates how much change occurs to our inspiration and expiration. The shorter duration, the less change. The longer duration, the higher intensity, obviously the more we start to inspire, the more we engage the additional muscles and the expiratory muscles. We start to shift, just like we did with that wave. We need to engage a steeper curve to get more in. And we force it out so that we can draw more in. And we start to increase the frequency and depth, our breathing rate and our tidal volume. So inspiration is the first thing that we can change. Now, we've already spoken about the active process and the passive process, and how inspiration is always using muscles, and expiration, starts off in this passive process, but it can become active if we engage the muscles. Now, our body is an efficient mechanism, so it will only go to switching on the expiratory muscles if we have to. So if exercise is of a low intensity or a short duration, and just manipulating the inspiration is enough to satisfy the demands, then it will leave it at that. It won't force expiration to increase in depth and speed, because we don't need it. Why would we engage muscles if we don't need to engage muscles? Because by forcing expiration and contracting muscles, that's also creating an energy demand. So we would then be breathing harder and faster to supply the respiratory muscles, which are working harder and faster. And it becomes this vicious cycle. So the body will try to satisfy demands by just manipulating inspiration to start with. And it will leave expiration as that passive process. Inspiration, slow passive expiration. Inspiration, slow passive expiration. Until the intensity gets to a point, or the duration hits a certain milestone, and we need to start switching on our expiratory muscles to get rid of that air faster so that we can breathe new air in sooner. And if we do that, and we switch on the expiratory muscles, we can start to diffuse more oxygen into the blood, because we are emptying them quicker and faster and more regularly. We get rid of it to then fill the lungs back up with the fresh air that is oxygen rich. And if we're getting rid of air faster, more regularly, then we're also going to be getting rid of more carbon dioxide per minute. So more O2 in, more CO2 out. That's exactly what we need if exercise intensity continues to increase and the duration of exercise continues to increase as well. So there is another activity sheet to sort of summarise all of that information. So like I've said before, download it, print it, store it, whatever. If you do need it, then the petutor.com is where you want to be going for that. But that is that. So we should now all know the anatomical components that work together to cause inspiration and expiration. We should know the muscles that engage to pull this rib cage around. We should know how air pressure ties into this. So what air pressure is, how it changes and what that causes to happen with airflow, and how that is linked to the thoracic cavity. And then we should know how both inspiration and expiration can respond a little bit differently to increasing exercise, intensity, and the duration as well. Where the inspiration engages first, faster and harder to get more fresh air in, and if it continues to increase or persist, that's when we start to engage the expiratory muscles to expel that air sooner to greater depths, so that we can get more fresh air in sooner in the next inspiratory cycle. And that is, or are, the mechanics of breathing. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, then fantastic. Make sure you do print off those resources and use those just to solidify your own understanding. Go back through it and pause it and take notes and revise, revisit it. Everything that you need to do to fully prepare for your exams. But that is that. So thank you for joining me for that group class. That was an enjoyable one. Well, they're all enjoyable, but that one particularly so. I hope you found it useful, and I hope to see you again next time. So have a good one. See you later.